Part 1. Before the dawn. The world she wakens into long, before the first pale light of morning touches the stone battlements of a medieval castle. The world within its walls is already quietly stirring. It is a world governed not by the gentle rhythms of nature alone, but by the rigid architecture of duty, hierarchy, and devotion. And at the very center of this world, surrounded by it, constrained by it, and in some measures empowered by it, lives the Queen. To understand a single day in the life of a medieval queen, we must first understand the world she inhabits. The medieval period in Europe spans roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the close of the 15th century, and within that vast arc of time, the role of the queen evolves considerably. Yet certain constants endure across the centuries and across the kingdoms. The queen is simultaneously a political instrument, a religious symbol, a household administrator, a mother, a diplomat, and in many cases, a survivor. She is born, or married, into a position that offers her remarkable access to power and remarkable vulnerability in equal measure. Her value to the kingdom is assessed in terms that might strike us as cold. Her lineage, her fertility, her dowry, her alliances, and yet, within the constraints of this world, many queens found not just endurance but genuine agency, crafting lives of intellectual depth, spiritual richness, and political consequence. To walk through her day is to step into a world of candlelight and incense, of whispered prayers and whispered conspiracies, of silk gowns and stone corridors, of children and courtiers and clerics, of music and medicine, and the relentless press of obligation. It is a world far removed from our own, and yet one driven by recognizable human needs. The desire for meaning, for safety, for connection, for dignity. Let us begin, then, at the very beginning. Let us begin in the dark. Chapter 1. The first hours, dawn, prayer, and rising. The queen does not sleep alone. This is perhaps one of the first things that distinguishes her existence from the private lives we take for granted today. Her bedchamber, the most intimate space in the castle, is nonetheless inhabited by her ladies-in-waiting, women of noble birth who sleep in the same room or in an adjoining antechamber, ready to attend her at any moment of the night. Privacy, in the modern sense, is a luxury that the medieval queen rarely possesses. Her bed is a grand affair. The royal bed in a high medieval court is a political statement as much as a piece of furniture. It is large, often requiring a step to mount, and elaborately curtained with heavy fabrics that serve both to retain warmth and to signal status. The mattress is stuffed with wool or feathers, the sheets of fine linen, the coverlets heavy with embroidery. In winter, bed curtains are drawn tight against the cold that seeps through the stone walls. In summer, they may be drawn back to allow the circulation of air. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, before the sky has begun to lighten, she is awakened. The first call of the day is not to breakfast or to business, it is to prayer. The canonical hours, the structured cycle of daily prayers, governs monastic life, exerts a powerful influence over the schedule of the medieval court as well. The hour known as matins or lauds, the night office, demands the faithful rise and offer their first thoughts to God. For a deeply devout queen, and many were, the depth of their faith varied considerably. This early rising is not a burden but a discipline she embraces. She kneels beside her bed, or in a small oratory adjacent to her chamber, a private chapel furnished with a prie-dieu, on altar cloth, perhaps a reliquary containing the relic of a saint whose intercession she particularly seeks. By candlelight or the thin gray light of dawn, she prays. The content of her prayers is not recorded for us in most cases, but we can reconstruct their shape. Praise for the soul of the king, her husband, She prays for the health and survival of her children. For infant mortality in them, the medieval period is devastating even in royal households. Perhaps especially in royal households, where the pressure on each child to survive and reproduce carries the weight of dynasties. She prays for the welfare of her kingdom. She prays for the souls of the dead, her own parents and siblings, ancestors whose memory is kept alive through prayer and through the masses she commissions. She may pray using a book of hours, a devotional text that becomes increasingly popular among wealthy lay people from the 13th century onward. These books are among the most exquisite objects produced in the medieval world. Small volumes, often no larger than a hand, illuminated with extraordinary miniature paintings, depicting scenes from the life of the Virgin, the saints, the seasons of the liturgical calendar. A queen's book of hours is often a masterpiece of craftsmanship, decorated with gold leaf and lapis lazuli, personalized with her coat of arms, and sometimes with portraits of her and her husband kneeling in prayer. It is also, in a very real sense, a companion, a portable sacred space she can carry with her throughout the day. After her private devotions, she may attend Mass. In a great royal palace or castle, a private chapel is standard, and a royal chaplain is on hand to celebrate the liturgy. The Queen attones Mass daily. This is not considered exceptional piety but basic religious obligation. She may attend again at various points throughout the day. The rhythm of the liturgical hours structures her entire existence, punctuating the business of governance and domestic management with repeated calls to divine remembrance. Once her religious obligations are met, or rather, once the first round of them is complete, for they will continue throughout the day, she turns to the business of rising. And rising, for a medieval queen, is itself a ceremony. Her ladies-in-waiting gather around her. These women, daughters and wives of noble families, are not merely servants. They are companions, confidances, and in some cases spies, placed in the queen's household by fathers or husbands who hope to gain intelligence about the movements of the court, or the inclinations of the queen herself. The relationship between a queen and her ladies is one of the most complex social dynamics of the medieval world. Intimate and hierarchical, warm and politically fraught. The process of dressing the queen is elaborate and time-consuming. First, a basin of water is brought, warmed in winter if the household can manage it. She washes her hands and face. Bathing the full body is a more occasional ritual, though it occurs more frequently than the stereotype of the unwashed Middle Ages might suggest. Great nobles do bathe, using wooden tubs filled with heated water, sometimes scented with herbs or rose petals. But daily immersion is not the norm, and the morning washing is a simpler affair. Her hair is attended to carefully. In much of the medieval period, a married woman's hair is covered in public. It is considered immodest to display it freely. But in the privacy of her chamber, her hair is combed and dressed before being confined beneath a wimple coif, or the elaborate headdresses that became fashionable in the later medieval centuries. The tall hennin, the butterfly headdress, the intricate crisscross and coils of wire and net that encase the hair in ornamental cages. Her undergarments are put on first, a linen chemise that falls to the ankles, smooth against the skin, easily washable, and thus washed far more frequently than the outer garments. Over this comes the kirtle, a closer-fitting gown that serves as an inner layer, laced or buttoned at the front or sides. Then the outer gown itself, often made of silk, velvet, or fine wool, depending on the season and the occasion, in rich colors that signal her status. Sumptuary laws in many medieval kingdoms regulate who may wear what colors and fabrics. The queen stands as above such restrictions, and wears what the treasury and the fashion of her court dictate. Her stockings are of fine wool or silk, held up by girders, Her shoes are of soft leather, pointed in the style fashionable in her era. Around her waist, a girdle, a belt of leather or fabric, often decorated with metalwork, from which hangs a small purse, sometimes keys to certain household stores, perhaps a small devotional object. Around her neck, a necklace. On her fingers, rings, including the ring of her marriage and perhaps others given to her by her husband or inherited from her mother. On formal occasions, a crown or coronet. On ordinary mornings, something simpler. The entire process of dressing may take an hour or more. By the time she is fully prepared to face the day, the castle around her is already in motion, its machinery of governance and domestic management grinding into gear. Chapter 2. Breaking the Fast, the Morning Meal and Its Meaning. The Queen's first meal of the day is not, by modern standards, what we would call breakfast. The medieval world has a more ambivalent relationship with the morning meal than our own. Religious tradition, particularly during fasting periods such as Lent, counsels against eating before the midday hour. On ordinary days, however, a light morning meal, called a jentaculum in Latin-influenced contexts, or simply a breaking of the night's fast, is customary for those who can afford it. For the Queen, this morning meal is taken in relative informality, often in her own chambers, or in a small dining room adjacent to the Great Hall. The Great Hall itself, the stage for the grand ceremonial meals of the court, is not always activated for the morning. The elaborate ritual of formal dining, with its hierarchical seating arrangements, its parade of dishes, its entertainment of musicians and jesters, is reserved primarily for the midday meal and the evening feast. The morning table nonetheless reflects the abundance of a royal household. White bread, made from finely sifted flour, is always present. The whiteness of the bread is itself a marker of status, since the poorest ate rough, dark bread made from less refined grains. There may be cold meats left from the previous day, or cheese, if it is a day of abstinence when meat is forbidden. Wine, diluted with water, may be served even in the morning, since clean drinking water cannot always be relied upon. Ale is more common in northern European courts. Honey, dried fruits, and preserved foods complete the picture. The Queen eats attended by her ladies and perhaps by a few senior household officials. The meal is not silent, conversation flows, though its tone is more private than the public theater of the Great Hall. This is one of the few times in the day when the Queen might speak relatively freely, when the performance of queenship can be momentarily set aside for something more human. And yet even here she is observed, assessed, and discussed. Her appetite, her mood, her words, all will be noted and repeated. The medieval court is a world of relentless surveillance, where information is currency and the Queen's behavior is perpetually on display, even in its most ostensibly private moments. Chapter 3. The Queen as Governor, Audiences, Petitions, and Counsel. By mid-morning, the Queen's day has shifted decisively from the personal to the political. The great medieval queens of history, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche of Castile, Margaret of Anjou, Isabella of Castile, Eleanor of Castile, Anne of Brittany, and many others, were not passive figures who waited in their chambers for the world to come to them. They governed, they administered, they negotiated, they adjudicated, they corresponded, they commanded. The degree to which a queen exercises political authority depends on a web of factors. Her personality, her husband's disposition, the political circumstances of the kingdom, whether she acts as regent during a husband's absence or minority of a child, and the legal traditions of the realm she inhabits. Some kingdoms allowed queens considerable formal power, others restricted them sharply. But in practice, even in systems that theoretically constrained female authority, A clever and determined queen found ways to exercise influence that the letter of the law might not anticipate. Perhaps the most public-facing aspect of the queen's political role is the granting of audiences. Members of the court, clergy, visiting nobles, ambassadors from foreign kingdoms, and sometimes even commoners with petitions may seek an audience with the queen. These audiences are carefully managed affairs, scheduled and filtered by the Queen's Chamberlain and senior household officials who determine who has access and in what order. The room in which these audiences take place, the Queen's Great Chamber, or Presence Chamber, is decorated to impress. Tapestries hang on the walls, their imagery often carrying political meaning. Scenes of biblical sovereignty, of royal hunts, of legendary heroes. The queen sits on a chair of state, elevated slightly above those who approach her, physical representation of the hierarchy of the moment. Her ladies stand nearby, and perhaps certain favored courtier, officials, and clerics whose presence lends the occasion additional authority. Petitioners approach with careful ceremony. They kneel, they speak. The queen listens, asks questions, perhaps consults a trusted advisor present in the room. She responds with a grant of land, a letter of support, a promise of intercession with the king, a referral to appropriate officials. Her decisions are recorded by a clerk or secretary who stands nearby with parchment and ink. The Queen's power of intercession is one of her most important political tools. The medieval tradition of queenly mercy, the idea that the Queen, as a figure associated with grace and compassion rather than strict justice, may plead with the clemency toward condemned prisoners or graced nobles, gives her a unique position in the machinery of royal government. She is not the source of the law, but she may soften its application. Many a man whose head was forfeit found himself spared by the timely intervention of a sympathetic queen. This role is not merely passive. Skilled queens used the power of intercession strategically, intervening on behalf of those whose fate might serve their political interests or strengthen alliances they wished to cultivate. The performance of mercy was simultaneously an act of genuine compassion and a tool of political management. In the absence of the king, through crusade, war, or travel, the queen may assume far more comprehensive authority as regent. The history of medieval Europe is punctuated by remarkable regencies. Blanche of Castile, who governed France with extraordinary skill during the minority of her son Louis X. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who administered England while Richard I was on crusade. Millicent of Jerusalem, who co-ruled her kingdom with confidence and political acuity. These women exercised the full machinery of royal government, issuing charters, levying taxes, adjudicating disputes, commanding armies, conducting diplomacy. Even on an ordinary day when the king is present and the queen's formal political role is less pronounced, she remains deeply engaged in the administration of her own household, which is itself a significant institution. The queen's household is not merely a domestic arrangement. It is a political and economic entity of considerable size and complexity. A great medieval queen's household might include dozens of ladies-in-waiting, a chamberlain who oversees the chamber staff, a steward who manages the finances and food supply, a master of the wardrobe who oversees clothing and personal possessions, a chancellor who handles correspondence, chaplains, and clerks who manage her religious and literary needs, grooms, pages, guards, cooks, laundresses, seamstresses, musicians, and a host of other specialists. To manage such a household requires genuine administrative skill, the ability to oversee budgets, to manage personnel, to plan provisions, to delegate effectively, and to maintain the complex social hierarchy of the court. The Queen's letters are among the most important tools of her political influence. Medieval queens wrote prodigiously to popes, to kings, to bishops, to abbots, to nobles, to their own children scattered across the kingdoms of Europe through strategic marriages. These letters were composed with care, often with the assistance of a trained clerk, in Latin or in the vernacular languages of the court. They were sealed with the queen's own seal, an instrument of considerable political authority, and dispatched by royal messengers whose reliability and speed could determine the outcome of crises. The content of these letters ranges widely. Requests for political support, expressions of condolence and congratulation, the management of disputed properties and marriages and inheritances, appeals for the welfare of individuals under the recipient's authority, and the delicate navigation of international diplomacy. A queen with connections to multiple royal houses. A common situation given the practice of dynastic marriage, serves as a living network of alliances, and her correspondence is the means by which that network is maintained. Chapter 4. The Queen as Mother. Children, education, and dynasty at some point during the morning, or perhaps in the intervals between audiences, administrative duties, the queen visits her children. This is both a personal act of love and a political necessity, for the children of the queen are the future of the dynasty, and the queen is their primary overseer, at least in their earliest years. The medieval attitude toward childhood differs significantly from our own. Children were understood to be small adults in moral terms, subject to the same spiritual dangers as grown men and women, requiring discipline and instruction in virtue from the earliest age. Yet medieval parents were not without affection for their children. The evidence of royal correspondence and chronicle literature makes abundantly clear that kings and queens grieved deeply for children who died, celebrated births with genuine joy, and worried about the welfare of sons and daughters sent far from home, diplomatic missions of marriage. The nursery of a royal household is an establishment in its own right. The king's and queen's children, ranging from infants to adolescents, are attended by a large staff. A wet nurse for infants, who is chosen with great care for her health and moral character. Rockers who tend the cradle, nurses who supervise the daily care of younger children, ladies who attend the girls as they grow older, tutors and masters who oversee the education of the boys, and, in some enlightened households, the girls as well. The queen oversees all of this. She may not nurse her children herself. The wet nurse, a woman of lower social standing, whose milk substitutes for the mother's, is standard in royal households. But she is involved in the selection of those who care for her children, in decisions about their education, in the arrangement of their future marriages, and in their spiritual formation. She prays for them, commissio masses for their health, and in moments of genuine leisure or genuine crisis, holds them close. The education of royal children is a matter of the utmost importance, and the queen is often its primary architect, at least in the earliest years. Girls are taught to read, often in Latin, and to manage a household. They learn to embroider and to sing and to play instruments. They are instructed in the management of a court. Boys, once they reach an age to leave the nursery, typically around 7, a threshold age in medieval thought, are sent to be educated in the household of a great lord, where they learn the arts of war and governance alongside other noble boys. But before that age, they remain in the world of women, and the queen's influence over her sons in their formative years is significant. Some queens took a keen interest in education beyond the nursery. Queens who were themselves literate and intellectually curious, and there were many, patronized scholars, commissioned translations, collected books, and created environments in which learning was valued and supported. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, was known for her interest in literature and her collection of manuscripts. Isabel of Bavaria, Queen of France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, commissioned remarkable illuminated manuscripts. Caterina Coronado, Queen of Cyprus, was a patron of humanist learning. These women understood that the cultivation of knowledge was both a personal pleasure and a political asset. The arrangement of their children's marriages is one of the Queen's most consequential responsibilities. Marriage in the medieval royal world is diplomacy by other means. The sealing of alliances between kingdoms through the joining of bodies and the exchange of children. The negotiations surrounding these marriages are often conducted over years, beginning when the children involved are still infants. The Queen participates in these negotiations, bringing her own understanding of the courts from which she comes, her knowledge of the families involved, and her internal interest in ensuring that her children are placed in situations where they will be treated with appropriate dignity. The anguish of sending a child away, sometimes to a foreign country where they will spend the rest of their lives, speaking a language they do not yet know, among people they have never met, is a recurring theme in medieval queenly correspondence. Margaret of Austria wrote movingly of her experiences. Eleanor of Castile brought her children with her on travels to maintain contact. The emotional cost of dynastic politics fell heavily on mothers. Part 2.0. The herd of the day. Ceremony, consel, culture. As the morning gives way to midday, the pace and character of the Queen's day shifts once again. The private and semi-private world of the early hours, the chamber, the chapel, the nursery, gives way to the more fully public world of the great hall and the ceremonial spaces of the court. This is the time of day when the performance of queenship is most visible, most scrutinized, and in some ways most demanding. Chapter 5. The Great Feast, dining as theater. The midday meal, the prandium, the dinner, is the central social event of the medieval court's day. It is not merely a meal, it is a performance of hierarchy, abundance, culture, and power. And the Queen is one of its central players. The great hall of a medieval castle or palace is the stage upon which much of courtly life is enacted. It is a large, high-ceilinged space, dominated by a hearth in its center or at one end, hung with banners and tapestries, furnished long trestle tables that can be assembled and disassembled as needed. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform known as the dais, stands the high table. The table at which the king, the queen, and the most honored guests of the court take their meals. Below them, in strict hierarchical order, the rest of the court is seated. The closer to the high table, the higher the rank. The Queen's place at the high table is to the king's right, or to his left. Conventions vary by kingdom and era. She sits on a chair of carved wood, cushioned, perhaps canopied. Before her, the finest of the court's table equipment, silver or gold plate, fine linen, the best knives, perhaps a nef, a ship-shaped table ornament that serves as a salt cellar and a symbol of royal status. The meal itself is an elaborate affair of multiple courses. A great feast at a medieval royal court might include dozens of dishes, brought out in succession by a parade of servants whose choreography is carefully managed by the steward of the hall. The food is organized around the great medieval distinction between meat and fish days. On meat days, roasted game and domestic animals in abundance. On fish days, the rivers and seas are plundered for alternatives. Either way, the food is elaborately prepared and presented. Medieval courtly cuisine is far more sophisticated than its reputation might suggest. The great kitchens of royal palaces employed master cooks trained in an elaborate culinary tradition that used spices imported from Asia, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, to create complex flavor profiles in sauces and stews. Pies of elaborate construction, stuffed with meats and spices, and sometimes with live birds that fly out when the crust is cut. The subtleties, as such theatrical culinary creations were known, are a feature of the grandest feasts. Dishes are colored with saffron to make them gold, with parsley to make them green, with sanctum red. Color is important as flavor in the aesthetics of medieval cookery. The queen does not simply eat. She receives portions offered to her by attendants. She tastes each dish. She makes gifts of food from her own plate to those seated near her, a gesture of favor with significant social meaning. She is watched. Her appetite, preferences, her interactions with those around her at table are observed and noted. A great queen knows how to make the meal a vehicle for social grace. A smile to the foreign ambassador, a word of appreciation to the steward for the quality of the feast, a gesture of inclusion to a newly arrived courtier. While the court dines, entertainment unfolds. Musicians perform, instrumentalists playing harps, fiddles, lutes, and wind instruments, creating a sonic backdrop that enhances the festive atmosphere. Minstrels sing, recounting the deeds of heroes, celebrating the valor of the king, honoring the beauty and virtue of the queen. Jesters and acrobats provide comic relief. Sometimes, a reading or recitation from a work of literature, a romance, a chronicle, an allegorical poem. The queen may be not merely the recipient of this cultural production, but its patron. Many of the great medieval queens were active patrons of literature and music, commissioning works, supporting artists, and creating courts where intellectual and aesthetic life flourished. Eleanor of Aquitaine's court in Poitiers, in the 12th century, is remembered as one of the great centers of courtly literature. The poetry of the troubadours, the concept of courtly love, the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, all of these flourished in an environment that Eleanor helped to create and sustain. Her patronage was not passive. She understood the political power of culture, its ability to shape reputation, to articulate values, to consolidate identity. Marie de France, one of the first known female authors writing in French, likely composed her lays, short narrative poems of love and adventure, for a courtly audience that included queens and their ladies. Christine de Pizan, the 14th century poet and prose writer who produced some of the most intellectually formidable works of the medieval period explicitly for and about queens. Her book of the City of Ladies constructs an imaginary city populated by virtuous women, a direct challenge to the misogynistic literary traditions of her time, and her treasure of the City of Ladies, also known as the Book of the Three Virtues, is a practical guidebook for women of all social ranks, from queens to chambermaids, advising them on how to navigate their world with wisdom and integrity. The queen, then, is not merely a consumer of culture, but a force within it, shaping what is made, what is valued, what survives. Chapter 6. The afternoon. Rest, recreation, and private life after the midday feast. The court takes a period of rest. The siesta, the early afternoon retreat from the day's business, is a common practice in medieval Europe, particularly in warmer climates, but also in northern courts where it provides a natural pause in the day's rhythm. The queen returns to her chambers. Her ladies disperse briefly to their own quarters or remain in attendance. The great hall all empties and quiets. But the queen's afternoon is rarely entirely restful. It is more accurately a shift from the public obligations of the morning to the semi-private activities that form the other half of her existence. The needlework, the reading, the music, the conversation, the management of correspondence, the reception of more intimate visitors. Needlework is one of the great occupations of the medieval noblewomen. This is not merely a domestic craft, but an artistic and political one. The great embroideries of the medieval period, most famously the biotapestry, which, despite its name, is an embroidery, are monumental works of historical record and political narrative. The women of noble houses produced embroideries of extraordinary technical skill and artistic sophistication, altar cloths, vestments for the clergy, bed hangings, wall panels, heraldic decorations. A queen's needlework might be displayed in her chapel, presented as a gift to a church, or given to a valued ally as a token of regard. The act of embroidering, for women who spend much of their lives in public performance, a form of relative privacy. One can think while one's hands are occupied. The afternoon sewing circle, the queen surrounded by her ladies with their frames and their silks, their needles moving rhythmically through the fabric, is a space where conversation can be frank, where laughter is permitted, where the mask of ceremony can be set aside somewhat. Reading is another afternoon occupation. For those queens fortunate enough to have received a literary education, reading in the medieval world is often done aloud. Even in private, the habit of reading silently that we take for granted is far less common in the medieval period. A lady might read to the queen from a romance, a saint's life, chronicle, a devotional text. The queen herself may read from her Book of Hours, or from a collection of poetry, or from one of the encyclopedic works of knowledge. Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae, Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Maius, that circulate in manuscript form through the literate world of the medieval court. Music is woven through the afternoon as through the rest of the day. The queen's household includes musicians and private music making. Singing, playing instruments, is a valued accomplishment for noble women. The lute, the psaltery, the small harp, these are instruments associated with feminine culture in the medieval court. Some queens were accomplished musicians themselves. Others simply enjoyed listening. Song was understood as a form of prayer as well as entertainment, and the repertoire of courtly music ranges from sacred polyphony to secular love songs to the elaborate compositions of the troubadour and trouve-taticians. The afternoon may bring more impet visitors. A trusted confessor with whom the queen discusses matters of conscience, a physician who attends to her health, a merchant displaying new fabrics or jewels for her consideration. The purchase of luxury goods is not trivial vanity in the medieval court. The queen's dress, her household furnishings, the gifts she distributes, all are instruments of political communication. The silk she wears to a particular ceremony sends a message. The jewel she gives to an ambassador is a statement of value. The tapestry she commissions for the great hall tells a story about what she and her household hold dear. Occasionally, the afternoon brings outdoor recreation. Hawking, falconry, is the great passion of the medieval nobility, and queens participated in it as fully as their male counterparts. The falcon on the wrist, the ride through the fields and forests, the cry of the dogs, the thrill of the hunt. These are pleasures available to queens as well as kings, and the chronicles record royal women riding out to hunt with apparent delight. Gardens, too, offer outdoor recreation of a gentler sort. The enclosed garden, the hortus conclusus, is both a practical space for growing herbs and a symbolic space of feminine pleasure and cultivation. Queens supervised and sometimes designed their own gardens, and the garden appears repeatedly in the literature of the period as associated with refinement, beauty, and a certain freedom from the pressures of the court. Chapter 7. The Queen and the Church, Spiritual Life and Religious Patronage. No account of the medieval Queen's Day would be complete without sustained attention to the role of religion, not merely as a private matter of piety, but as a defining framework for every aspect of her life, her role, and her identity. The medieval world is, for the men and women who inhabit it, thoroughly saturated with the sacred. God is not a figure of private belief confined to the space of church and prayer. He is the governor of history, the arbiter of justice, the author of hierarchy, the source of all legitimate authority. The king governs by divine right. The queen is anointed at her coronation with holy oil in a ceremony that explicitly marks her as a consecrated figure, set apart from ordinary womanhood by the grace of God flowing through the rites of the Church. This theological framework has practical implications. The Queen's piety is not merely her private affair. It is a public statement about the spiritual health of the court and the kingdom. A queen who is known for her generosity to the poor, her support of monasteries and nunneries, her commissioning of masses and prayers, her patronage of relics and pilgrimage. This queen enhances the sacred aura of the dynasty and performs, for her contemporaries, one of the central functions of queenship. The queen's religious patronage takes many forms. She endows monasteries, providing the financial foundation, land, income-producing properties, gifts of plate and vestments, that allows religious communities to sustain themselves. She funds hospitals and almshouses, institutions that provide medical care and charity to the sick and the poor in the name of the queen and her family. She commissions the construction or embellishment of chapels, altars, churches, physically marking the landscape with her piety. These acts of patronage are recorded in the cartularies, the registers of donations maintained by religious institutions, and in the chronicles that celebrate the virtue of great queens. They are, simultaneously, genuine acts of faith and calculated political investments. A queen who supports a powerful monastery gains the prayers of its community, political alliance of its abbot, and a spiritual treasury of merit that, in the theological understanding of the period, will serve her in this life and the next. Some queens went further, establishing their own religious communities or maintaining particularly close relationships with individual religious figures. Hedwig of Silesia, Queen of Poland in the early 13th century, was canonized as a saint. Her life of personal austerity, her care for the sick and poor, and her founding of a Cistercian monastery at Trebnitz marks her as extraordinary even by the demanding standards of medieval female piety. Elizabeth of Hungary, daughter of a king and wife of a landgrave, gave away her possessions and devoted herself to the care of the sick. She too was canonized shortly after her death. Not all queens sought sainthood, but all were expected to demonstrate a sincere commitment to the Christian life. The afternoon hours bring another round of prayers at the canonical hour of none. The day will close with Vespers and Compline. Between these liturgical anchors, the queen moves through her world carrying the consciousness of divine scrutiny that the theology of her age insists upon. She is observed by God as she is observed by the court. Her motives are transparent to the Almighty even when they are opaque to her subjects. This awareness, or at least its performance, shapes her conduct at every moment. The queen also engages actively with the landscape of sacred power that populates her world. Relics, the physical remains or personal objects of saints, are among the most potent forces in the medieval spiritual universe. A relic of the true cross, a bone of an apostle, a garment that touched the body of the Virgin. These objects are understood to radiate divine power, to heal the sick, to protect the faithful, to bring the intercession of the saint in question to bear upon human affairs. Queens collect relics, display them in their private chapels, carry them on their bodies as protection, and make pilgrimages to the great shrines where the most powerful relics are venerated. Pilgrimages are significant events in the life of a medieval queen. The journey to a great shrine, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, Cologne in Germany, Jerusalem itself, for the most ambitious and devout, is simultaneously a religious act, a political performance, and an adventure. The Queen travels with a large retinue, lodges at monasteries and great houses along the way, distributes alms to the poor she encounters, and arrives at the shrine to pray for the intentions she carries in her heart. The physical journey is understood to mirror the spiritual journey of the soul toward God. Part 3. The evening ceremony, council, and the close of day, as the afternoon light begins to decline and the castle's torches are lit against the gathering dark, the Queen's day moves toward its final chapter. The evening hours bring another shift in the character of her obligations. The great ceremonial dinner, the final audiences of the day, the political conversations that take place in the spaces between ceremony and sleep, and at last the return to the chamber where the day began. Chapter 8. Vespers and the evening meal. The canonical hour of Vespers, the evening prayer, marks the transition from afternoon to evening. The Queen and members of her household gather in the chapel, or the Queen attends in her private oratory. The prayers of Vespers are among the most beautiful of the canonical hours. The great hymns of the Church ring out in the voices of the chaplains. The candles glow against the stone, and for a few minutes the weight of the day's business is set aside in favor of the eternal. After Vespers, the evening meal. If the midday dinner is the great theatrical production of the day, the evening meal, the supper, the cena, is somewhat less formal, though still governed by hierarchy and protocol. It may take place in the great hall, or, particularly in winter when heating the vast space is impractical, in a smaller room. The fare is lighter than at midday, and the entertainment present is more subdued. The evening is also a time for more private political business. The King and Queen may confer together, reviewing the day's events, discussing decisions that need to be made, planning the management of crises and opportunities. This private consultation between husband and wife is one of the Queen's most important political functions, and one of the most difficult to document, since it leaves few written traces. But we know from the testimony of contemporaries and from the pattern of events that queens, who were trusted and capable, frequently be served as their husbands' most intimate political counsel. Henry II of England discussed policy with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Louis XVI of France relied the advice of his mother Adela of Champagne. Philip II of Spain valued the counsel of his grandmother Juana of Castile in his early reign. The evening also brings visitors of a different kind than the morning. The intimates of the court who gather in the Queen's presence chamber for entertainment and conversation. Music, games, storytelling. The evening in a medieval court is not silent. Chess is the great game of the nobility, complex, strategic, associated with the exercise of intelligence and foresight that are the hallmarks of good governance. Tables, a backgammon-like game, is also popular. Card games became fashionable in the later medieval centuries. Word games, riddles, literary discussions. The intellectual life of the court is sustained by these evening gatherings. The Queen's presence chamber in the evening is a space of considerable political importance. It is here that alliances are formed and dissolved in the casual register of social conversation, that favors are sought through the medium of entertainment, that young courtier jockey for the Queen's attention and the advancement it might bring. The Queen manages this space with the same political intelligence she brings to her morning audiences, though here the instrument of management is charm rather than formal authority. The troubadour tradition of courtly love, the idealized celebration of a noble lady by a devotee who pledges his service to her, is, among other things, a cultural representation of this dynamic. The poetry of courtly love, which flourishes in the courts of southern France and spreads throughout Europe from the 12th century onward, positions the Queen or Great Lady as the source of all value, the arbiter of all virtue, the object of all devotion. This is, of course, a literary convention, but literary conventions do not arise in a vacuum. They reflect and reinforce social realities. In the real courts of medieval Europe, great ladies did exercise a kind of cultural authority, a power to set standards of behavior and refinement that the poetry both celebrated and helped to create. Chapter 9. The Queen in Crisis, War, and Dynastic Peril. A chapter on the medieval queen's typical day be incomplete without acknowledgement that many of her days were not typical at all, that the rhythm of prayer and governance, of feasting and needlework, was regularly disrupted by the crises that were the constant companions of medieval life. Illness is the most pervasive of these crises. The medieval world is a world of extraordinary medical vulnerability, where diseases that we now prevent or cure with relative ease, smallpox, typhoid plague, dysentery, childhood infections, sweep through communities with terrifying speed, sparing neither the noble nor the poor, the young nor the old. Royal households, despite their relative affluence, were not immune. Queens watched their children die with heartbreaking frequency. They nursed their husbands through fevers that might prove fatal. They themselves faced the enormous medical risks of repeated childbearing. Medieval medicine, while not without genuine insights, lacked the foundational understanding of germ theory and the pharmacological tools that make modern medicine effective. The Queen's physicians, trained in the Galenic tradition of humoral medicine, which seeks to balance the four humors of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile through diet, bloodletting, and herbal remedies, do their best with the knowledge they possess. Some of their treatments are genuinely helpful. Certain herbal remedies do have pharmacological effects. The emphasis on diet and rest has merit. The understanding that certain substances are toxic shows a rudimentary form of medical reasoning. But many treatments are ineffective, and some, such as aggressive bloodletting in already weakened patients, are actively harmful. The Queen herself is often involved in the medical care of her household. The great ladies of the medieval period were expected to know the basics of herbal medicine, to be able to manage the sick within their households and on their estates. Many kept buria, books of herbal recipes, and some were genuinely knowledgeable about the properties of medicinal plants. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess, who was one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval world, wrote extensively on medicine, natural history, and theology. Her botanical knowledge, though embedded in a framework very different from modern science, shows genuine, observational insight. War is another constant disruptor of the Queen's routine. The medieval world is a world in which warfare is not an exceptional emergency, but a persistent background condition, the management of which is one of the central responsibilities of the ruling class. The Queen's husband is frequently away on campaign. She may be called upon to govern in his absence, to manage the defense of territories, to negotiate with hostile powers, to raise funds and supplies for armies in the field. Some queens found themselves not merely managing war from a distance, but actively in Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses, was one of the most militarily active queens in English history, commanding armies, forging alliances, never surrendering her determination to secure the throne for her husband Henry VI and their son. Isabella of Castile rode on campaign against the Moors, personally directing the military operations that culminated in the fall of Granada in 192. These are exceptional cases, but they illuminate the degree to which the medieval queen's role could expand under pressure to encompass almost any function that the survival of her dynasty required. The boundaries of queenly behavior were not fixed. They were elastic, stretched by circumstance to accommodate women of determination and capability. Then there is the crisis of dynastic failure, the failure to produce an heir, or the loss of an heir already born. The pressure on medieval queens to produce male children who would survive to adulthood is immense and unrelenting, and the consequences of failure can be catastrophic. A queen who does not produce an heir risks repudiation, the dissolution of her marriage, and her return to her father's house in disgrace. A queen whose sons die one by one watches the reason for her own position erode with each funeral. The historical record is full of queens who endured this particular form of anguish. Anne of Cleves, married to Henry and quickly discarded. Catherine, Aragon, whose failure to produce a living male heir contributed to one of the most consequential ruptures in the history of Christianity. The unnamed queens of the Capetian dynasty, whose inability to produce surviving male heirs created the succession crisis that would eventually lead to the 100 Years' War. In the face of these crises, of illness, war, and dynastic threat, the queen's piety becomes not merely a practice but a lifeline. Prayer, the commissioning of masses, pilgrimage, the veneration of relics. These are not superstitions but technologies of survival, the tools with which medieval people, including their queens, attempted to manage a world in which so much lay beyond human control. To pray is to act. To surrender to God's will is not passivity, but the highest form of agency available in a world where the gap between human effort and human outcome is so brutally wide. Chapter 10: The Queen and the Court, Diplomacy, Alliances, and the Art of Influence throughout the day. At every point where the queen interacts with the world beyond her immediate household, she is engaged in the practice of diplomacy. This is not diplomacy in the formal, institutional sense of modern international relations. The permanent embassies, the multilateral negotiations, the written treaties with their elaborate protocols. Medieval diplomacy is a more personal, more intimate, more improvisational affair, and the queen is one of its most important practitioners. The queen's diplomatic importance derives from several sources. First, she is frequently of foreign birth herself, married to her husband's kingdom as part of a diplomatic agreement between her father's realm and his. This means she has personal knowledge of and family connections to a foreign court, connections that can be invaluable when that court's cooperation is needed. She speaks the language, knows the customs, understands the personalities and the political fault lines of a world that to her husband may be alien. Second, the queen's role as a woman, outside the strict military and political hierarchies of masculine governance, gives her certain diplomatic freedoms that men do not possess. She can speak to the wives and mothers of her husband's rivals in terms that transcend political enmity. She can offer comfort and mediation in situations where a direct approach by the king would be seen as aggression. The queenly art of gentle influence, the soft word, the personal letter, the gift chosen with knowledge of the recipient's tastes, is sometimes more effective than the hard tools of political pressure. Third, the queen's household is itself a diplomatic instrument. The great ladies who serve her are the daughters and wives of the realm's most powerful men. The foreign visitors who are received into the queen's presence chamber are assessed and cultivated as potential allies. The marriages she arranges for her ladies are themselves small diplomatic agreements, weaving connections between families and thus between political factions. The reception of foreign ambassadors is one of the formal diplomatic occasions of the Queen's Day. An ambassador from a neighboring kingdom come to congratulate on a royal birth, to negotiate a trade agreement, to seek the Queen's support for a particular political position, is received with ceremony. The Queen meets him in her presence chamber, dressed and jeweled appropriately to the occasion. She speaks through an interpreter if the ambassador's language is not her own, though many queens were accomplished linguists. Eleanor of Castile spoke French, Spanish, and perhaps some Latin. Catharina d'Aragona was fluent in Latin, Spanish, French, and English. The ambassador brings gifts, objects chosen to appeal to the Queen's known interests, goods that represent the finest products of his kingdom, tokens of the regard in which his master holds her. She receives these gifts graciously, distributes counter-gifts from her own stores, and converses about matters both political and personal. Every word she speaks will be reported back to the court he represents. Every nuance of her manner, her dress, her household's display will be assessed for what it reveals about the Queen's mood, the court's prosperity, the kingdom's stability. Beyond the formal reception of ambassadors, the Queen exercises diplomatic influence through her correspondence. Her letters to foreign rulers are instruments of statecraft, carefully worded to achieve specific ends, while maintaining the forms of personal affection and Christian courtesy that govern international relations. She writes to recommend individuals for favors, to express concern about the treatment of her subjects abroad, to seek intelligence about the intentions of foreign courts, to maintain the web of personal relationships that sustains the alliance systems on which medieval kingdoms depend. The marriage negotiations that occupy so much of that attention for her children and for the children of her nobles are themselves a form of continuous diplomacy, a permanent reshaping of the alliance landscape through the joining of families. The Queen brings to these negotiations an understanding of the human dimension of political alliances that pure political calculation often misses. She knows which princess will be happy in her son's court, which king's daughter will adapt to the climate and customs of a distant kingdom, which marriage will be fruitful, and which will founder on the incompatibility of personalities, or the unreality of political expectations. Chapter 11, The Queen's Household Economics, Wealth, Dower, and Financial Agency. The medieval queen is not merely a figure of ceremony and spiritual authority. She is a significant economic actor. Her financial resources, while dependent on and often constrained by the king's will, give her a degree of material independence that is crucial to her ability to exercise the other aspects of her role. The Queen's primary source of income is her dower, the lands and revenues assigned to her at the time of her marriage as a provision for her widowhood. In most medieval kingdoms, the Queen's dower is established by law or custom as a specific fraction of the royal estates, typically 1/3. These dower lands provide a substantial income. Rents from tenants, revenues from mills and markets, income from the exploitation of forests and fisheries and mines. The management of these estates is a significant administrative undertaking, requiring oversight of local officials, attention to disputes between tenants, management of records and accounts. In addition to her dower lands, Queen may receive gifts from the king, grants of additional land or income, transfers of royal revenues to support particular expenses. She may receive gifts from foreign rulers, from wealthy subjects seeking her favor, from religious institutions grateful for her patronage. She administers her own house budget, overseeing the expenditures on food, clothing, servants' wages, religious patronage, gifts, and the 100 other costs of maintaining a royal establishment. The Queen's financial agency is most visible in her acts of patronage. The churches she endows, the monasteries she founds, the books she commissions, the artists she supports, all of these require financial investment. And the Queen's ability to make these investments gives her real power in shaping the cultural and religious landscape of her kingdom. When Eleanor of Aquitaine endowed the abbey at Fonterrade, or when Blanche of Castile supported the construction of the Sainte-Chapelle, or when Margaret Beaufort endowed Christ Church and St. John's College at Cambridge, these were not merely pious acts, but exercises of economic power that shaped institutions lasting for centuries. The Queen also exercises economic power through her management of the marriages and inheritance of the great families of the realm. Wardship, the right to manage the estates of a minor heir, was a significant source of royal oil income in medieval England and other kingdoms, and queens who were granted wardships exercised considerable economic authority over the affected properties. The arrangement of marriages for wealthy widows, another prerogative of the crown, could generate substantial revenues for the queen who managed it. Her widowhood, should she survive her husband, brings its own financial dimensions. The Queen Dowager, the widow of a king, is entitled to her dower lands and often to two additional provisions made by her husband in his will. Some queen dowagers were formidably wealthy by the standards of their age, and their wealth gave them independence and influence that their position as the king's consort had perhaps not fully allowed. Eleanor of Aquitaine, after the death of Henry II, exercised a degree of autonomous authority in her own territories that she had not enjoyed since her first marriage. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry, said, "We accumulated extraordinary resources and influence in her widowhood that made her one of the most powerful figures in England at the turn of the 16th century." Part 4. The Night. Compline, Reflection, and the Passage of Time. The day is drawing to its close. The torches burn lower. The great hall empties as the court disperses to its various accommodations within the castle complex. The sounds of the court fade. The music, the conversation, the movement of servants through the corridors. And in their place comes the quieter sound of an institution settling into the night. Chapter 12. Compline and the Last Hours. The final canonical hour of the day is Compline, the night prayer, the prayer of completion. It is a short office, its prayers a farewell to day, a commendation of the sleeper to God's protection through the hours of darkness. The imagery of Compline is rich with the metaphor of night as death, and sleep as its rehearsal. A reminder, gentle but insistent, of the mortality that underlies even the most splendid earthly existence. The Queen attends Compline in her chapel or oratory, perhaps accompanied by a few of her ladies. The chaplain intones the prayers in the candlelight. The Queen follows, her lips moving with the familiar Latin words that she has heard and spoken since childhood. After Compline, the day's prayer is formally complete, until Matins wakes her once more before dawn. In the last hour before sleep, the Queen's ladies prepare the bedchamber for the night. Fresh linen, the warming of the bed with hot stones in cold weather, the closing of the curtains against drafts. The great candle is lit on the bedside table. Lesser lights are extinguished. A night watch is set. A trusted attendant who will remain awake through the night, ready to respond if the Queen calls, standing guard over her sleep, as others stand guard over the castle's walls. The Queen's last thoughts before sleep, like her first thoughts upon waking, are, in the devotional framework of her world, ideally turned toward God. A brief private prayer, a recitation of the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria, a moment of examination of conscience. The medieval tradition of daily spiritual accounting encourages the faithful to review the day's actions before sleep, to note where they have fallen short of virtue, to ask forgiveness, and resolve to do better. The Queen, no less than the most humble of her subjects, is subject to this discipline. But the queen lying in her curtained bed at the end of the day has more than spiritual accounts to settle. She has the day's events to turn over in her mind. The audience that went unexpectedly well, the letter that arrived with troubling news from a distant court, the conversation with the king that left certain important matters unresolved, the concern for a child whose health has seemed fragile, and tension between two of her ladies that threatens to disrupt the harmony of the household. The political and personal are inextricably intertwined in the medieval queen's consciousness, and the hours before sleep are often the only moments of genuine solitude in which she can process them. Chapter 13. The Queen Across the Centuries, Variety and Continuity. We have been speaking, throughout this account, of a medieval in something approaching the singular, as if there were one type of queen, one pattern of daily life, one set of obligations and opportunities that applies universally. But the medieval period spans 1,000 years and encompasses dozens of kingdoms, and the experience of individual queens within that vast space and time varies enormously. The queen of a small Irish kingdom in the 9th century inhabits a very different world from the Queen of France in the 13th century. The Queen of Norman Sicily, a kingdom distinguished by its remarkable multicultural character, where Latin, Greek, and Arabic were all used in royal administration, experiences a form of courtly life utterly unlike that of her contemporary in Castile. The Queen of Hungary navigates different legal traditions, different religious landscapes, different cultural expectations than the Queen of England. The period of the Crusades, from the late 11th to the late 13th century, creates specific contexts for queenly experience. The Crusader kingdoms of the Levant, Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, are constitutional novelties in which women sometimes inherit and rule in their own right, since the small, embattled Crusader nobility cannot afford to exclude capable women from governance. Melisende of Jerusalem, Sibylla of Jerusalem, Isabella I of Jerusalem. These women exercised royal authority in ways that would have been unusual, though not impossible, in the kingdoms of Western Europe. The urgency of military survival in the Crusader states created space for female governance that peacetime kingdoms might not have tolerated. The development of vernacular literacy in the 12th and 13th centuries opens new possibilities for queens as patrons and participants in intellectual culture. Before this period, the written world belongs largely to the Latin literate clergy. The laity, even the noble laity, engages with it primarily through hearing, but as vernacular literature, French romances, German minnesingers, Italian poetry, expands the audience for written culture to include literate lay people. Queens become active participants in a new kind of cultural production, commissioning works in languages accessible to wider audiences, themselves sometimes composing and creating courts where literary life flourishes. The Black Death, which strikes Europe in 1347 and 1048, and returns repeatedly throughout the later medieval centuries, reshapes the world of the medieval court as it reshapes everything else. The death toll, perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population in the initial outbreak, dismantles established hierarchies, disrupts economic systems, challenges theological frameworks, and creates new opportunities for social mobility. The courts of the later medieval period are in some ways more dynamic, more anxious, and more conscious of mortality than those of the earlier centuries. And the queens of the 14th and 15th centuries navigate a world significantly different from that of their predecessors. The rise of humanism in the Italian Renaissance, which in its earliest phases is contemporaneous with the later medieval centuries in the rest of Europe, introduces new ideals of queenly excellence. the learned princess, versed in Latin and Greek, able to correspond with humanist scholars and to service patron of the new learning. Caterina Cornero in Cyprus, Isabella d'Este in Mantua, Beatrice of Aragon in Naples and Hungary. These women represent a transitional figure, one foot in the medieval world of dynastic oblast legation and courtly ceremony, another in the Renaissance world of humanist scholarship and artistic patronage. Chapter 14. The Queen's Legacy, Memory, Representation, and Historical Recovery. As our day in the life of the medieval queen draws toward its close, it is worth pausing to consider how we know what we know about these women, and how much we do not know and cannot know, because of the nature of the historical record. The medieval queen has left a complex legacy of documentation. Charters, the formal legal documents by which land is granted, confirmed, or exchanged, bear her seal and sometimes her own witness or attestation. Account books record the expenditures of her household. Letters, where they survive, give us her voice in something approaching its own idiom. Though filtered through the conventions of medieval epistolary form and often written in collaboration with a clerk rather than in her own hand. Chronicles, the narrative histories written by monks, courtiers, and other observers of the medieval world, include her in their accounts, though always through the lens of male authorship and the gender assumptions that lens entails. The chronicles can be frustratingly unreliable guides to the inner life of medieval queens. Male chroniclers often reduce queens to their reproductive function, noting their pregnancies and childbirths, lamenting their failures of fertility, celebrating their deaths in childbirth as pious sacrifice, or to their role as political instruments, the daughters given to seal a treaty and the wives expected to cement an alliance. The emotional and intellectual interior of these women is often invisible in the chronicle record, recoverable only through inference and the careful reading of what is present against an understanding of what is absent. More revealing, sometimes, are the material traces of the queen's life. The books of hours she used for prayer, with the signs of personal use that scholars can read in the wear of the pages and the marginal annotations. The embroideries and textiles her household produced, whose iconographic programs reflect choices about meaning and representation. The tombs and effigies commissioned for her burial and those of her family, whose imagery encodes theological and dynastic meanings. The buildings she commissioned or supported, whose architectural programs reflect her patronage priorities and her understanding of the spiritual and political landscape. The history of medieval queens as a field of serious scholarly inquiry is relatively recent. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, history was written primarily as a history of men, kings, bishops, commanders, and men appeared in it primarily as accessories to male protagonists, notable only when their behavior was exceptional enough to force itself into the record. The feminist historiography of the later 20th century and the broader turn towards social history, the history of everyday life, and the recovery of marginalized voices has transformed our understanding of medieval women's experience. Scholars such as Pauline Stafford, Janet Nelson, Teresa Ehrenfeit, and many others have brought rigorous methodology and genuine intellectual curiosity to the recovery of medieval queens' lives, drawing on charter evidence, numismatic evidence, archaeological evidence, and the full range of literary sources to reconstruct the world of these women with new depth and accuracy. What this scholarship reveals is not a story of simple oppression or simple triumph, but a story of immense complexity. Medieval queens inhabited a world structured by profound inequalities of gender, in which women were legally, theologically, and socially subordinate to men. And yet, within the structures of that world, individual women of intelligence, ambition, and capability found ways to exercise real power, to shape the world around them, to leave lasting legacies. The tension between constraint and agency, between the expectations of their world and the capabilities of individual women, is the central drama of medieval queenship. And it is a drama without a simple resolution. Part 5 Portrait Gallery, Grit Queens of the Medieval World. To bring the abstract account of the medieval Queen's Day into sharper focus, let us turn briefly to the lives of specific women, whose stories illuminate the range of queenly experience across the medieval centuries. Each of these women is in some sense an exceptional figure, but their exceptionalism throws into relief the conditions of the world they inhabited, conditions that shaped the lives of every queen of their era. Chapter 15, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Queen of Two Kingdoms. No figure in the history of medieval queenship is more celebrated, or more contested, than Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was born around 1122, became Queen of France at 15, Queen of England at 30, outlived 2 husbands and most of her children, and died in 1, 2, or 4, at an age that made her, by medieval standards, extraordinarily old. Eleanor was, first and foremost, a great heiress. The Duchy of Aquitaine, which she inherited from her father William X in 1137, was one of the largest and richest territories in France, comprising much of what is now southwestern France. Her marriage to Louis XVI of France, arranged within weeks of her father's death, to prevent the duchy from passing out of the Capetian orbit through her marriage to a rival, made her Queen of France and brought Aquitaine into the French royal sphere, at least notionally. But Eleanor's relationship with Louis was never easy. The king was pious, reserved, and politically cautious in ways that grated against Eleanor's more assertive and worldly temperament. The marriage between Eleanor and Louis lasted 15 years and produced 2 daughters, but no surviving sons. A dynastic failure that eventually became the basis for the dissolution of the marriage. The annulment of 152, granted on the grounds of consanguinity, freed Eleanor to pursue her own political agenda. And within weeks, she had married Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, who within 2 years would also become King of England. As Queen of England, Eleanor presided over one of the most tumultuous reigns in English history. Henry II's quarrel with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, culminated in Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, a crime that horrified Christian Europe, and from which Henry never fully recovered his reputation. The rebellion of Eleanor and her sons against Henry in 1703, a genuinely extraordinary event. A queen leading her children in open rebellion against their father, ended with Eleanor's capture and 16 years of imprisonment. She spent these years confined in English royal castles, her political influence curtailed though not entirely extinguished, writing occasional letters, managing her remaining resources, waiting. She was released at the age of 67 when Henry II died, and her son Richard came to the throne. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable phase of her career. She governed England as regent during Richard's crusade, suppressed a rebellion by her youngest son John, traveled to Navarre to fetch Richard's bride, Berengaria, negotiated Richard's ransom when he was captured by the Duke of Austria on his return from crusade, and continued to exercise political influence deep into her 70s. When Richard died in 199 and John became king, Eleanor did not retire. She traveled through her Duchy of Aquitaine at the age nearly 80, receiving homage from her subjects and securing the loyalty of the region for her son. Eleanor's day, any day in her long and extraordinary life, would have differed significantly depending on the moment. The young queen in Paris attending the elaborate court of Louis XVI, the imprisoned queen in England, managing what resources she could from confinement. The Dowager Queen of England, governing a realm in her son's absence with the full machinery of royal administration at her disposal. The specific texture of her daily experience changes across these phases, but certain constants persist. The intelligence, the determination, the political acumen, and the physical resilience that allowed one woman to inhabit the highest political roles of her age for nearly 7 decades. Chapter 16, Blanche of Castile. The queen who governed France, if Eleanor of Aquitaine, represents the queen as political actor in her own right. Blanche of Castile, daughter of Alfonso III of Castile and Eleanor of England, granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, wife of Louis of France, mother of Louis Ox, represents the queen as regent, as the woman who governs in the name of another. Blanche was born in 1988 in Castile and came to France in 100, part of the diplomatic settlement between England, in which Eleanor of Aquitaine, her grandmother, played the central role. She married the future Louis Vuitton when she was 12 and he was 13, and the marriage proved both personally harmonious and politically productive, producing 12 children, of whom 8 survived to adulthood, a remarkable number by medieval standards. Louis Vuitton died in 126, leaving Blanche as regent for their 12-year-old son Louis X. The regency she exercised was not a brief interlude, but a formative period of French history, lasting nearly a decade, during which Blanche governed the kingdom with extraordinary skill, navigating the challenges posed by rebellious French barons who chafed at the authority of a foreign-born woman, managing the continuing campaigns against the Albigensian heresy in southern France, maintaining the kingdom's alliances, and overseeing the education and formation of the young king, who would become St. Louis, the most celebrated monarch in French medieval history. The chroniclers of the time, and many historians since, have been ambivalent about Blanche. Her enemies, and she had many, among the barons who resented her authority, and the English king, who challenged French territorial claims, portrayed her as domineering, cold, politically ruthless. Her admirers celebrated her intelligence, her piety, and her devotion to her son. The reality, as always, is more complex than either portrait. What is clear is that Blanche of Castile was among the most effective rulers of 13th century France, male or female. She governed the kingdom, made the decisions, signed the charters, waged the wars, managed the politics of an exceptionally turbulent period with a skill that few kings have equaled. And she did this while simultaneously raising a son who, under her influence, developed the extraordinary personal piety and commitment to justice that would earn him canonization 50 years after his death. The relationship between Blanche and Louis Ox is one of the most studied in medieval history, and it illuminates the complex dynamics of queenly influence over the next generation. Louis's biographer, Joinville, describes the Queen Mother's profound influence on her son's religious formation, her insistence on his regular attendance at Mass, her management of his household even after his marriage. She is said to have told him that she would rather see him dead, guilty of mortal sin, a remark that, while extreme by modern standards, perfectly encapsulates the medieval moral framework in which his education was conducted. Chapter 17, Isabella of Castile. The queen who remade a world at the far end of the medieval period stands a figure who in some ways marks its conclusion. In the beginning of the ending of the Vela, Isabella, who was born in 451, became Queen of Castile in 1474, conquered Granada in 1492, sponsored the voyage of Christopher Columbus in the same year, and died in 1804 leaving behind a kingdom transformed, a reputation both magnificent and deeply troubling, and a historical legacy whose consequences are still felt in every corner of the globe. Isabella's path to the throne was neither smooth nor inevitable. She was the daughter of Juan II of Castile by his second wife, and spent much of her youth in a position of political vulnerability, dependent on the goodwill of her half-brother, King Henry AV, whose reign was characterized by civil conflict and succession disputes. Henry's own daughter Juana, whether or not she was his legitimate child was a matter of fierce political controversy, was Isabella's rival for the succession, and the conflict between their supporters defined Castilian politics for 2 decades. Isabella's marriage in 469 to Ferdinand of Aragon, arranged in defiance of Henry IV's wishes, conducted with a degree of clandestine daring that reads more like romance than politics, proved to be one of the most consequential dynastic unions in European history. The joining of Castile and Aragon under their joint rule created the institutional foundation of what would become Spain. The conquest of Anguenta in 1992 completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long process of Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. And the sponsorship of Columbus's voyage opened the Americas to European contact, with consequences for both Americas and Europe that cannot be overstated. Isabella's day, in the years of active rule, would have been consumed by governance on an exceptional scale. She traveled constantly, moving with the court between the cities of Castile, Segovia, Toledo, Valladolid, Burgos, Sevilla, and during the Granada campaign, she spent years in military encampments, managing the logistics of a major war while simultaneously governing the largest kingdom in Western Europe. She was deeply involved in the reform of the Castilian Church, working with her confessor Cardinal Cisneros to combat cleric corruption and enforce discipline. She was a patron of the arts and of scholarship, though her humanist interests were always subordinate to her overriding religious commitments, and she oversaw, with her husband, the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, an institution whose methods and consequences represent one of the darkest chapters of late medieval and early modern history, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 492. One of the year's 3 great events, alongside the fall of Granada and the voyage of Columbus, was a decision in which Isabella was fully complicit, and it stands as a reminder that the greatness we attribute to historical figures is always partial, always shadowed by the decisions they made, caused immeasurable suffering. The medieval queen, like all historical actors, must be assessed in the fullness of her choices, not only the ones that cast her in a favorable light. Isabella died in 1504, her body worn out by decades of continuous governance and repeated childbearing. She had outlived her eldest son Juan, whose death in 1497 devastated her, and had seen the mental illness her daughter Juana began to manifest, threatening the succession she had worked so hard to secure. Her will, carefully constructed to ensure the continuation of her political legacy, reflects the same qualities that had defined her life: intelligence, determination, piety, and an unflinching willingness to pursue what she believed to be right, regardless of the cost. Part 6. Looking for meaning. What a Queen's Day tells us. We have walked through the hours of a medieval Queen's Day, from the pre-dawn darkness of prayer to the candlelit close of Compline. We have seen her in her private devotions, and in the public theater of the Great Hall, in the intimacy of the nursery, and the formality of the audience chamber, in the arts of the needle and the arts of diplomacy, in the crises of illness and war and dynastic threat, and in the quieter satisfactions of governance well managed and culture generously supported. What does this day tell us? What can we take from it that is more than historical curiosity? Chapter 18, The Paradox of Power. The medieval queen's experience is a profound study in the paradox of power, in the way that authority and constraint are not opposites, but are instead intertwined, each shaping and limiting the other. The queen possesses extraordinary resources: wealth, access, social position, the symbolic weight of her consecrated status, the political leverage of her dynastic connections. And yet she is constrained by her gender in ways that her male counterparts are not, subject to a theological and legal framework that defines her as subordinate to men and reduces her ultimate value to her reproductive capacity. What medieval queens teach us, what the great ones demonstrate with particular clarity, is that power is not simply given but is also made, shaped by the intelligence and will of those who exercise it, expanded or contracted by the choices they make and the relationships they build. The queen who sits passively in her chamber, beautiful and ornamental, is one kind of queen. The queen who attends to her correspondence, who manages her household with precision, who cultivates her relationships with the clergy and the nobility, who intercedes effectively for those who need her help, who supports the arts and letters of her time, who raises her children wisdom and care. This queen is doing something more than occupying a role. She is making something of it. The medieval world understood this, at least partially, even within its restrictive gender frameworks. The theory of queenship, articulated in the advice literature, the chronicles, the ceremonial texts, acknowledges that a good queen is not merely a good woman, but a good governor, and that governance requires qualities of mind and character that are not inherently gendered. The queen is praised for her prudentia, her practical wisdom, as much as for her pietas and her misericordia. She is expected to be intelligent, well-advised, and capable of judgment. The very fact that so many medieval queens succeeded in exercising significant political influence is evidence that the world around them, whatever its theoretical commitments to female subordination, made room for female capability when it appeared. Chapter 19. The body as political instrument. The medieval queen's body is the most intimate and the most public thing about her. It is the source of heirs, the seal of alliances, the vessel of divine grace at her coronation, the object of theological discourse about female nature, the site of illness and childbirth and aging and death. And it is constantly watched. The degree to which the queen's physical existence is politicized, the attention paid to her pregnancies, the scrutiny of her appearance, the public management of her illness and death, reflects a broader truth about medieval political culture: that the boundary between the personal and the political is essentially non-existent at the highest levels of society. The private life of the queen is never entirely private, because she is always simultaneously a person and an institution. This total politicization of the body is one of the most difficult aspects of queenly existence to appreciate from a modern perspective. We are accustomed to thinking of our bodies as private, as belonging to ourselves, in a way that is not contingent on our social role. For the medieval queen, this privacy of the body simply does not exist. Her fertility is a matter of national concern. Her health is tracked and managed by physicians whose primary loyalty is to the dynasty rather than to the patient. Her appearance is governed by codes of dress and display that reflect the political need of the court as much as her personal taste. And yet the queen's body is also a vehicle for personal expression, for resistance, for communication. The queen who chooses to nurse a sick child herself, contrary to the expectation that this function be delegated to servants, makes a statement about her values. The queen who goes on pilgrimage despite the physical discomforts of the journey, makes a statement about her piety and her determination. The queen who appears in public magnificently dressed and jeweled at a moment of political crisis makes a statement about the confidence of the dynasty. The body, even in its constrained and politicized form, remains a medium through which the individual expresses herself. Chapter 20: Faith, Agency, and the Sacred Architecture of Daily Life throughout the medieval Queen's Day. Prayer, Airn, and observance are not intrusions into the secular business of governance, but the framework within which all of it takes place. The canonical hours structure the day. The liturgical calendar structures the year. The theology of divine sovereignty structures the understanding of all earthly authority. To understand the medieval queen's inner life, insofar as we can access it, we must take this religious framework seriously, not as mere convention, but as a genuine architecture of meaning. The queen who prays before dawn is not performing a ritual emptied of content. She is engaging with a theological understanding of the world that gives her life its deepest meaning. Her children's lives, her husband's reign, the welfare of her kingdom, her own hopes and fears, all of these are placed in the context of an eternal order that transcends the political accidents of a particular reign. God governs history. Queens and kings are instruments of his purpose. Prayer is the means by which those instruments align themselves with their source. This framework is simultaneously comforting and demanding. It offers the queen a perspective that can sustain her through the losses and setbacks of her political life. The miscarriages and infant deaths, the betrayals and failures, the long separations from those she loves, and it demands of her a standard of personal conduct that the scrutiny of God, unlike the scrutiny of the court, cannot be managed or deflected. The queen is, in the theological understanding of her world, always and finally accountable to a judge whose judgment is both perfect and inescapable. This sense of divine accountability is not merely a source of anxiety. It is also a source of what we might call moral agency, the conviction that one's choices matter, that they have consequences that extend beyond the political calculations of the court into an eternal order. Many of the queens who acted with the greatest courage and integrity in the face of extraordinary pressure did so out of a conviction that their fidelity to their deepest values was itself a form of faithfulness to God. Eleanor of Aquitaine's refusal to be destroyed by Henry's imprisonment. Blanche of Castile's unflinching governance in the face of baronial hostility. Isabella of Castile's determination to complete the Reconquista. The countless queens whose names history has not preserved, who simply did their duty with as much grace and intelligence as they could manage. All of these choices were made in the context of a theological framework that both constrained and sustained them. Chapter 21: The Long Shadow of Medieval Queenship. As we step back from the medieval Queen's Day and consider its larger significance, we find ourselves confronted not just with a historical curiosity, with a set of questions that remain urgently relevant to our own time. How do individuals exercise power within institutions that were not designed for them? How does personal life coexist with public obligation? How do we assess the moral complexity of historical figures who achieved great things by methods we find troubling? How does the body become a political object? And what are the costs of that objectification? How does sustain individuals in conditions of extreme adversity? These are not merely academic questions. They are questions about the nature of power, identity, of moral agency, and of human resilience that confront every generation and every society. The medieval queen's answers to them, forged in the specific conditions of a world
radically different from our own, cannot be our answers. But the process of encountering them, of taking them seriously, of refusing to reduce these women to their most convenient or most dramatic attributes enriches our understanding of the full range of human possibility. The medieval queen inhabited a world of candles and stone, of silk and sorrow, of prayer and politics, of love and loss and relentless obligation. She moved through that world with the resources available to her, the intelligence she had cultivated, the relationships she had built, the faith she had inherited, and, in many cases, deepened the sheer will to endure and to act in the face of circumstances she had not chosen. In this, she is not so different from those who came before her or those who have come since. That is, perhaps, the deepest truth that her day reveals, that beneath the extraordinary distance of time and culture, the women who wore medieval crowns were engaged in the same fundamental project as every human being who has ever lived. The project of making meaning, of finding purpose, of acting with dignity and intention in a world that offers no guarantees and demands everything. Epilogia. The day close, the candle on the queen's bedside table burns low. The castle is quiet now. Even the night watch has settled into its slow vigil. The curtains of the great bed are drawn against the dark, and behind them, the queen of this medieval world. Our composite queen, assembled from 1,000 documented lives and 1,000 inferences from the evidence they left behind, lies in the darkness
that is both literal and metaphorical, darkness that precedes whatever tomorrow will bring. Tomorrow will bring more prayers, more audiences, more letters, more negotiations, more concern for her children's health, more management of a household that is also an institution. It will bring the small pleasures of a piece of music heard unexpectedly, a falcon's stoop, the smell of herbs in the garden,
a moment of genuine laughter with a trusted companion. It will bring, as all days in all lives bring, a mixture of what she has chosen and what has been chosen for her, of what she can control and what she cannot, of satisfaction and frustration, of meaning and mystery. She has done today what medieval queens did every day. She has governed, not in the narrow sense of issuing decrees and commanding armies.
Some did those things too, but in the larger sense of managing the complex, demanding, often beautiful, often terrible business of a life, lived at the intersection of the personal and the political, the sacred and the secular, the human and the historical. She will wake again before dawn. The prayers will begin again. The ladies will turn again. Will assemble, and the great machinery of medieval governance will turn, and in the center of it, wearing the crown that is both her inheritance and her burden, the queen will take her place, and the day will begin again. Historical notes and further reading. This narration draws on a broad foundation of historical scholarship on medieval queenship, courtly life, the material, spiritual, and political culture of the medieval European world. The women whose lives are discussed in the port sections, Eleanor of Aquitaine, of Castile, and Isabella of Castile, are among the most extensively documented queens of the medieval period, and the account of their lives here, while necessarily compressed, is grounded in the scholarly consensus about their careers. For those interested in exploring the history of medieval queenship in greater depth, the scholarship of Pauline Stafford, particularly her studies of early medieval queens in England, provides an invaluable foundation. Teresa Ehrenfeit's work on queenship in the Crown of Aragon and her broader theoretical contributions to the field offers sophisticated frameworks for understanding the exercise of queenly power. Janet L. Nelson's studies of Carolingian queens and the ritual dimensions of queenship illuminate the early medieval period. For Eleanor of Aquitaine specifically, the biographies by Alison Weir and John Flory, among others, provide accessible entry points into her remarkable life. For Blanche of Castile, Linda Grant's biography is the definitive scholarly account. For Isabella of Castile, Peggy Liss and Henry Kamen have written comprehensive biographical studies, The Material Culture of the Medieval Court, The Books of Hours, the Tapestries, the Embroideries, the Illuminated Manuscripts. Is accessible through the collections of major museums around the world, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and the Cloisters, also in New York. These objects, many of them made for or by queens and great ladies of the medieval period, bring the visual and tactile world of medieval queenship alive in ways that no written description can fully replicate. The history of medieval women more broadly, their roles in the economy, in religion, in the arts, in medicine, in everyday life, has been the subject of an extraordinary flowering of scholarship in recent decades, much of it inspired by the feminist historiography of the 1970s and 90s and 1980s, expanded by subsequent generations of scholars, working with an ever wider range of sources and methodologies. This scholarship has fundamentally transformed our understanding of the medieval world, restoring to it the presence, the agency, and the voices of women who had for too long been rendered invisible by a historical tradition that privileged male actors and male-authored sources. The medieval queen, at the apex of this world of women, offers a uniquely visible entry point into that larger history, a figure whose life, because of her prominence, has left enough traces in the documentary and material record to permit something approaching a genuine reconstruction of her experience. But she is a window as well as a subject. Through her, we see the world of the women around her, her ladies-in-waiting, her nurses, her embroiderers, her laundresses, the wives of her courtiers, the abbesses of the convents she patronized, the peasant women on her estates, a world whose texture and meaning the recovery of the queen's own experience helps us to understand. The day has ended. The history continues.